Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Livingstone, and today we're going to be talking about pricing. So with any discussion, we always start out with a problem, and this video's problem is that photographers in general usually have a hard time pricing their work, and they often undercharge for the amount of time and resources that they invest into their work. So why is this a problem? Or better yet, why should you care? Well, if you want to continue to do photography on a regular basis, you need to find a way to make it sustainable. I know many photographers that have fallen out of the practice just because they were finding diminishing returns and they haven't been able to keep up with it, and then they often find themselves working more at any other job to be able to fund their creative habit rather than making their creative habit fund itself. Keep in mind, the more time you spend at your job working to fund your creative passion means less time actually doing your creative passion. For example, consider all the money that you've invested into one camera body, one lens, and the editing software that you use. All of that, upwards of a couple $1,000s, just to take a single photograph. Now imagine doing a photo shoot with all that equipment for just $100. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, right? If anything, you're paying your client to take photos of them, because you're the one losing money in this situation and they're just getting an insane deal from you, being able to use all of your equipment and your knowledge and skills for such a low rate. So, what is the solution here? Well, to start, stop charging based on time. Now, this isn't the end-all be-all to making your passion a sustainable business, and I want to put a disclaimer that there are exceptions to this advice. It's important to stay educated on your market standards and traditions to make sure you're not pricing yourself way out of your market or underpricing yourself and never getting any work anyway. The best way I can put it is you're not going to charge the same amount for a family portrait session as you would for a full-scale wedding. Now, there are people who are able to do that and charge $10,000 to do a family portrait session, but those people are so advanced in business, and that's not what we're talking about right now. What we are talking about is making your passion sustainable at the very least. So what I mean by this is, yes, do factor in time into what you're charging, but keep in mind that it's still just a factor, not the answer. Some other factors to keep in mind are your gear, your equipment rental, your location or studio space, your insurance, all of your subscriptions and software. On top of that, your experience as well. That's such a big one that people forget about all the time. The longer that you've been doing this and the more experience that you have, the more valuable that is to your clients and the people that you work with. You've gone through so many things that maybe an amateur photographer or someone starting out doesn't have, and you can approach situations with more knowledge to problem solve easier or make things a little more efficient, and you should be charging for that. So how else can we actually go about figuring out some real numbers? Well, the first place I would start is calculate your cost of doing business. If you've never done this before, it can be really simple and sometimes actually really interesting, because when you ask someone what their cost of doing business is, off the top of their head, the number that they'll probably give you is much, much lower than the real value. There are a lot of factors to consider when you're doing photography, which can be a very expensive hobby or profession. And you can go really deep with this too, not just factoring things like a camera, a lens, a stand, a studio, but down to the memory card even will add up really quickly. So once you calculate your cost of doing business, keep in mind that that's the value that you can charge to net even, making no money but also losing no money. So what you would want to do is charge your profit on top of that, whatever money you want to walk away with after you're done with a session. So when you're trying to figure out what you want to charge on top of that to make profit, you have to factor in your life expenses, which things like rent, utilities, whatever you want to use for recreation, and so on. One thing that people don't often know is that you can very easily price yourself out of a job by charging too little. Most people think it's the other way around, because that's how it's most commonly represented. However, there are definitely situations where charging too little will make you look so devalued that a customer doesn't even want to work with you. They think that you're too cheap, or that reflects the quality of your work, even if that might not be the case. A good example that I always like to tell people is if you were a headshot photographer and you were working in a mid-market, you would probably be charging somewhere in between $100 to $200, or maybe even a little bit more, per person that you were photographing in a group at a company. Now, for example, if you were to do that kind of work for a while and you knew about what your pricing was and you said, I charge $150 per person at any company that approaches me. But then one day, Warren Buffett approaches you and says, hey, I need a headshot. Are you going to charge him the same rate that you normally would for your typical clients? Some people would say that you should charge what you normally do for a high-profile client like that. I actually disagree. I think you need to scale the pricing to the level that your client is at. Someone like Warren Buffett is certainly not paying $200 for a headshot. He's most likely going with the top of the top pros who charge a couple thousand for a session, especially on something as simple as headshots, because he knows that the quality of their work matches their pricing. And this is something that you can do with your own work. If you feel like you have enough experience and you feel like the quality of your product and your images are coming out on a professional level, you should be able to charge a professional rate. So I know that's a really extreme example, but I think it accurately represents what I'm trying to describe when I say charge for your client, not your time. You're not gonna be worried about how many 1 or 2 hour sessions you're gonna have if you're shooting someone like Warren Buffett or another high profile client like that and say, oh, it's only gonna take me an hour or two to do it. I should only charge $200 per person, when the person you're shooting is worth millions. So we can dial that example back a little bit and scale it and say maybe not millions, but definitely at least a couple hundred, or maybe even 1,000 or 2,000 on a group session with a mid-sized or high-sized company. But at the end of the day, while you are factoring in time, there's so much other stuff that goes into it, and that's why people often undercharge for their services. So that just about wraps up our conversation for the day. If you got any good information out of this, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. And while you're there, consider hitting that notification bell and check out my Patreon. If you're a patron of any of my tiers, you'll be able to see videos just like this before they're published anywhere else, along with a ton of other exclusive content. With all that said, I'll see you in the next video, and be sure to do something creative today.